first. So Deb and Becky and Steph might have already heard all this in the beginning. And then hopefully, so I'm going to frame disability, I'm going to frame ableism, and then I'm going to go into kind of like what makes gender-based violence against people with disabilities different. And then I'm not sure I'm going to have enough time to go into accommodations and accessibility today, so that'll probably be next week, and we can tease out. So, and then my hope is, one, that you'll kind of take this into your work and either reach out to us to do more stuff with you all, because we have a grant that's the Deaf and Disability Resource Center. So we can do more stuff with you all so that we can make sure that tribes are, and other grantees are able to like kind of think about how to serve people with disabilities a little bit better. And then also we want to learn kind of if the way that we're doing training in TA resonates for tribes. Because we want more and more culturally specific programs and tribes to apply for funding to work with people with disabilities, but we're the TA provider, and we want to make sure that we are providing, equitable, accessible TA. All right, so I have a little interactive exercise at the beginning, which I think will be fun. It's nice to see you. Hi, Linda. It's been a long time. It's like old home week. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And then we have 2 hours. I want to take a break in between. Jolene, will you remind me in case I get kind of caught up? Okay. All right, so I'm using a slide that's focusing on the impact of racism and ableism, because this is kind of how I do this presentation for folks. I think you all know this, but I'm gonna kind of help you with the ableism piece. Okay, do you just see the one slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's kind of think about, why are we talking about people with disabilities? And the reason that we're talking about people with disabilities is because people with disabilities in our society are a very large part of our society. 1 in 5 people with disabilities, 1 in 5 people in the US have a disability. And also because they are victimized at much higher rates than people without disabilities. And they're not getting to healing services. They're not, if they're trying to make reports about the crime, they're not being taken. Cases aren't investigated and moved forward. And there's very few prosecutions. And only 12% of people with disabilities that are victimized get any kind of healing services. So, and if we're all lucky enough, we're going to age to a point where we're going to get a disability. So the numbers are really just going to keep going up. And the problem is that systems and services aren't working for survivors with disabilities. And we see this because of the balance. Like, we know that people with disabilities are about 4 times more likely to experience violent crime. And they're more likely to experience that several times, I should say many times over their lifespan. The victimization is longer lasting. And those high rates of victimizations are also more serious offenses. and only 12% of people with disabilities get any kind of formal support to heal from the trauma and rebuild their lives. So let's kind of look at disability. So I want to first kind of focus on how we are socialized to think about people with disabilities. So I have this little video montage. I'm gonna show a video. This video the video clips that I'm gonna show you are the ways in which our society has depicted disability in movies and television shows. And I have questions after each clip of what, kind of like, what are you supposed to think about this? So we can either do that in the chat, or you guys can unmute and chat with me, talk to me, meaning. So whichever way feels more comfortable to you. And I like this because we don't think about oftentimes how we're socialized to think about things. And so there's some really nuances to this as well. Okay, so here we go. Let's start.
At this for an hour. That's all I promise.
Sue, there's just one more person on the list. Give her a shot.
Becky Johnson.
Jackson.
Jackson.
Be nice, Sue.
I heard that you do a routine with jump ropes. I want to show you what I can do.
Becky, I'm going to stop you right there. You're in. Be at practice tomorrow at 4 p.m. Congratulations.
Okay, so what do you notice about how Becky was treated in this clip? Any thoughts?
I thought about that initial reaction where he said, like, be nice. Like, there was like this assumption that kind of like right off the bat, just by appearances, that the treatment wasn't going to be good or something was going to happen like that in the interaction, right?
Right. Good point. Did anybody watch Glee?
I was going to say, I've seen this, and I actually just recently was thinking about kind of this exact scene, right? And how is this handled? Because in some ways it is very good. And in other ways, it has this, like, especially with folks who have Down syndrome, this infantilizing or like the magical part that comes with people. So
yes,
yeah,
exactly.
And that's where I get kind of like stuck, because also like, oh, it turns out her sister also had Down syndrome or whatever.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, so we can relate kindly only to people who we see as pure or innocent in these ways. That
exactly. Oh my God, Jolene, you should be doing this.
Morgan has her hand raised.
Oh, Morgan. Thanks, Jolene.
I was just thinking too about how, sort of unconscious bias plays out, right? And like I felt a lot of that sort of apprehension and anxiety watching the video. It was like, well, what's going to happen, right? Like, how are people going to respond? How are people going to act? And it sort of makes me think, having a neurodivergent child, and also my niece is autistic and nonverbal, like the responses that we have as a society and what's sort of embedded in us, right? For whether that's environmentally or what have you, or based on experience and how we're raised, but just that our reactions are sort of and really sort of a part of a much broader, right, like social response. And that we're still having these conversations, right, where we have to build awareness instead of that there's an acceptance that people that we're all different, we're all humans, and that's okay, and that we don't have to say, oh, you be nice, right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. And this is like, so in this show, Sue is someone who is not very nice, but the show itself, so take it out of the context of the story, the show itself highlights this relationship between Sue, who's the pep squatter. I forget what, they weren't cheerleaders. They are cheerleaders, but they called them something else. I forget. But she was in charge of that squad, and she was really mean and hard on people, but then was really kind to the student with Down syndrome. And they highlight this relationship as being this really good thing. But really what they did was they show in society how we have very little expectations for people with Down syndrome. Oh, the Cheerios. Thank you so much, Jolene. So we have this kind of, well, she has Down syndrome. She can't do any better. So we're just going to accept her. And we're supposed to feel good about that because she's really happy that she's going to be on the team. So any other thoughts that people have just on this segment? There's quite a few, so don't worry. Okay, I'm going to move to the next segment.
I'm Lucy's father.
But are you?
See,
yeah,
I'm her father.
Are you really? I'm not talking about the fact that you got some homeless woman pregnant. I'm not talking.
Objection, Your Honor.
Get to the question, Mr. Turner.
Yeah. The question is, if you love your daughter as much as you say you do, and I know that you do, don't you think she deserves more? Don't you, in your heart of hearts, secretly question yourself every day, don't you?
Objection, compound questions.
Okay, yeah.
Was that a yes?
Yeah, I think Lucy deserves everything. See, yeah, in my heart of hearts, I think she deserves everything.
Yes, she does.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, she does. Yes, she does. And you agree with everyone here that you can't give her that.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
You can't give her that.
Yeah, maybe everybody's right, see. Yeah, maybe everybody's right about that, see. Okay, so no more now, okay? No more now, okay?
Okay, so sorry, I know that one was pretty low. What were some of the baseline assumptions on display in this clip? So the Sean Penn character has an intellectual developmental disability.
I think the assumption was that because of his disability, he could not care for his daughter, that he was not competent to care for her and give her everything that she needed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's really, really obvious in this clip. And the way this whole movie, so this is from the movie I Am Sam. And so it feeds into the stereotype that people with intellectual disabilities are not intelligent and they need help to live. And so, of course, they can't take care of a child is the idea.
Right.
Which is not true. We have a lot of self-advocates that we work with that have intellectual disabilities that live and live on their own, independently, that work, that do all sorts of stuff. But I think that this notion is still very prevalent. And in fact, in 35 states, child welfare can take the kids away from someone merely because of their disability.
Wow.
And in the in tribal communities, ableism and racism has come together to take away people's children and put them in boarding schools, and also to take people's lands away. So it's the two things coming together that. So it's a long time that we've been using that someone is not competent to make their own decisions to take their children away. Okay, next clip. Oh, this one's fun.
his, you know.
Right, well, so the layman's term for what you both have is jock itch. It's common if you spend a lot of time in damp clothes, and it's easily transferable via intercourse. Yeah, I'll give you an antifungal cream, but you both have to keep the area dry and avoid sex for 2 weeks.
Okay, I love this because I love this movie too. So what did you notice in this clip about the way the daughter interprets for her parents, and what implications does that have?
Well, it just makes me think about the reason why we get interpreters that are not family members.
Exactly.
And, you know, not having, a child should not have to be the interpreter.
Yeah, and so that's exactly what this point is. This happens a lot in deaf community because people don't know oftentimes where to get ASL interpreters or anything about it, so they just don't. And then a family member ends up doing the interpretation. There's a couple things though that I wanted also to pull out. This is a movie that happened. This movie came out, what, in 2022 or 2021? This movie uses all deaf actors, and that, in large part because it was produced, directed, kind of put everything was because of Marlee Matlin, who's a deaf actor. In the previous clips, in the I Am Sam, that was from the, I want to say the 90s. And in the 90s, what we're going to see over and over again is actors playing people with disabilities, where in the Glee episode, we actually have both things happening. So later in Glee, they have a person with an actor with Down syndrome playing a person with Down syndrome, but from the very beginning, they have a actor without a disability playing an actor who's a wheelchair user. So, and so there's an assumption that is made that, one, people with disabilities are not good actors, that people with disabilities aren't going to be able to follow a script or know what they're doing, so they just use other people as actors. So the reason I kind of wanted is to show the progression of how that's changing now, but still a problem. So like in the Willy Wonka movie that just came out, there was a lot of controversy about the fact that they had, what's the actor's name that played the dwarf character, the little person in the show. It's the guy from Notting Hill. I can't remember his name for some reason.
Hugh Grant.
Thank you, Hugh Grant. They had Hugh Grant play that role instead of having like Peter Dinklage, who is a little person who's an actor, or there's quite a few. And so there was a lot of controversy about that now because that is no longer acceptable. Okay, so next.
Get out of here! I'm staying right here! Get out of here! Staying right here. I'll blow your fucking head off. Then do it. You want to do it? Do it. Let's go. Get out of here! Well, you fucked up, all right? So what? So everybody does it. Get on with your life, would you? What life? I got no life! I'm in the dark here! You understand? I'm in the dark! So give up. You want to give up, give up. Because I'm giving up too. You said I'm through, you're right, I am through. We're both through, it's all over. So let's get on, let's fucking do it. Let's fucking pull the trigger, you miserable blind motherfucker.
Okay, so there's so much wrong with that movie. So this is from Scent of a Woman that, again, I think was in the early 90s. And what is it telling you about people who acquire a disability in their life? So this is someone who was in the military and is now blind.
I think it implies something about quality of life, right? Like that there's no like that's the be all end all, I guess, just as like the obvious one.
Yeah, exactly. And Morgan?
I also see, like there seems to be this sort of undercurrent of like, it's almost like he's feeling defeated, right? And that, okay, like Becky's saying, it sort of speaks to the quality of life. And I worked with someone who slowly lost their sight. And that wasn't the perspective that individual had. So I think also, right, it's like pretty shallow in the interpretation of the variety of experiences that people will have when they're, coming upon acquiring a disability or impairment. So
Yep, exactly. So this really, really feeds into, and a lot of these other clips that we'll see feed into the fact that being a person with a disability is being less than people without disabilities, and life is no longer worth living. It's still a really, really big notion in our society. Like, just think about, was it the Emmys that just recently happened where they honored Christina Applegate, or she came and appeared, and it's because, like, oh my God, she has multiple sclerosis. It's that narrative is still very much there. Like, like it's like people feel sorry for her. It's a standing ovation because look, she looks like everybody else, and here she is on the stage. Like, it just kind of still feeds into this sense of, I mean, it is a really big change in someone's life, and it is, this is a chronic condition, but it doesn't mean it's the end of her life. And that's the way we think about acquired disabilities and blindness in particular. So lots and lots of stereotyping. Morgan, exactly right. Okay, let's move to the next one. Oh, the other thing I want to note is these movies that we picked to show, like the depictions, the movies and the television shows were really, really popular. Most of these movies received Oscar nominations, and the actors that played the people with disabilities received Oscars because, like, look, they're playing this person with a disability. Like, it's all of this infuses kind of what we think about disability in our society, because it's part of our media, it's part of our everything, and really prominently so.
I can't be like this, Frankie. Not after what I done. I seen the world. People chanted my name. Not my name, some damn name you gave me. They were chanting for me. I was in magazines. You think I ever dreamed that happened? I was born at 2 pounds, 1.5 ounces. Daddy used to tell me I fought to get into this world. And I'd fight my way out. That's all I want to do, Frankie. I just don't want to fight you to do it. I got what I needed. I got it all. Don't let them keep taking it away from me. Don't let me lie here till I can't hear those people chanting no more.
I can't. Please. Please don't ask me.
I'm asking.
I can't.
Okay. So what did this movie tell us about acquiring a physical disability? Do you remember when this movie came out? Oh, so this is $1 Million Baby. I remember when this movie came out, it was like it was this twist in the movie. You thought it was going to be this women's boxing movie. Yeah, it was an Oscar winner. Like what's her toes? Hilary Swank won an Oscar for her performance. What's her toes? Yeah. Yeah. So again, if you acquire a disability, you're not, yeah, your life isn't worth living anymore. Yeah, and Becky said, I was just thinking about all of the characters that Hilary Swank has played. I know, right? So
can I
go
add
ahead.
something too?
Yeah.
Olga? I also think, and I mean, just like I sort of kind of also thinking about I know this is sort of a sensitive topic, so I apologize, but like euthanasia, right? And like it, like folks being able, it also is sort of suggesting like that to me, having known folks that have chosen that for various reasons, ALS and other things, I think that it's also suggesting like folks aren't like there's like this inability, right, like to be able to like sort of make that choice for yourself or to sort of like have that come to fruition, right? Like that someone else has to do this for you or help you in some way, and like that you're losing some agency or autonomy over your bodily integrity and choices. And so I don't know, I'm just feeling a little bit of that too, right? That that there's this sense of powerlessness.
Right.
Right. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's such a good point. So, and that's something that people with disabilities experience their whole lives, is other people having control over their lives, them not having power to like live independently, to make their own decisions. And those are because there's a lot of policies in place that require, like if a service provider finds out something's happening to a person with a disability, they have to report it. And then the Adult Protective Services Agency gets involved in their situation and they lose control over anything, over the fact that they might have fought for years to be independent. It's all intermixed. So again, we have a person without a disability playing a person with a disability. It makes more sense in this movie because it's an acquired disability and that's what happens in the movie. But also that her life isn't worth living now. and because she has a disability. And so then I think about someone like Christopher Reeve, who did acquire this disability and who did struggle, but then also came out of it on the other side, having a really full life and then becoming an advocate for people with disabilities. So it doesn't touch on any of that. None of these movies touch on any of it. And we have a bunch more in here, but I think this is like kind of gives you an idea of the way we have been taught to think about people with disabilities in our society. So let me kind of go back now to kind of what disability, kind of a little foundation of disability. So we have people with disabilities. The disabilities could be kind of in these broad categories, could be differences in cognition, might be intellectual, differences, people with physical disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, and sensory disabilities. So these are just kind of the broad categories that disability might sit in. Hold on one second. We live in a rural area, so we have a landline because our phones, you never know. Oh, interesting. Might qualify providers under the current language, which is just important for us to follow at the very least, right, Jolene? Exactly. Okay, so then also the thing about disabilities is that they can be invisible or visible. So for example, I have an invisible disability and an acquired disability, meaning that I wasn't born with the disability that I have. I acquired it at a very young age, you know, because of the abuse that happened in my home. But so it could be acquired or it can be congenital. Someone could be born with it. It could be a temporary disability, a recurring one, or a chronic one. So when I had back surgery a year and a half ago, I had a temporary disability because my mobility was very limited at that point, and then no longer have that. And then chronic disabilities are conditions that you live with that can be disabling, not necessarily completely, but like, for example, diabetes is considered a disability. You have to be careful for a lot of different reasons with diabetes. So just as an example, and then also there are people that have multiple disabilities. So for example, I have dissociative identity disorder, I have a panic disorder, I have anxiety, I have depression. I'm really kind of like a hot mess of psychiatric disabilities. But, and then as I get older, I might acquire a physical disability. And then other things to think about when you're thinking about disabilities is that a diagnosis does not predict individual experience. And this is the best example for this is autism. There are people that have autism that kind of show up across a long spectrum, very wide spectrum. So what I did this training a couple months back with one of the consultants that we work with in Vermont. He's a Black man with autism, and he stands up and he says, so the thing about autism is that my experience of autism is my experience of autism. Now that you've met me, you've met a Black man with autism, it does not mean that every person with autism is going to show up the way I do, and does not mean that every Black person with autism is going to show up the way I do. And not all people who have disabilities identify as a person that has a disability. In fact, I think it's funny because I was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, DID, when I was 31. And I went through a intense healing process, and I've lived with it since then, like knowing that I have it since then. But it wasn't until I think 2016 when Nancy Smith came to me and asked me to be part of a disability work group that I realized that DID was a disability. So I spent like a long time thinking, oh yeah, I have DID, but not considering myself as a person with a disability. And that's true for lots and lots of people. So it's just things to kind of keep in mind when you're working with people with disabilities. And then our treatment of disability has been very ableist and oppressive. So in our society, we had years and years and years ago thought of disability as a religious or moral, in a religious or moral context, like you must be being punished for having a child with a disability. Can you all hear my dog? Is that it? Because I can go let her out if it gets to be disruptive. No? Okay, good. All right.
I couldn't hear it.
Okay. she does this little thing where she just, nobody wants to play with her. So she lays around and barks and makes all sorts of noise. So, it's been this kind of oppressive attitude about people with disabilities that if you are a person with a disability, you are morally, there's something wrong with you, like morally, like God did this to you for a reason type of approach. Then there's this shift into a pity charity model, which a good example of that is, I'm not sure if you're old enough to remember when Jerry Lewis used to do the telethon for multiple muscular dystrophy. He would every year around Labor Day, he would do that marathon, that telethon to raise money. And he would show all these videos of how sad their lives were. And kind of like, so there was this charity model where, oh, poor person with a disability, we need to help them. And then we've shifted more into a medical model, which is there's something wrong with them, let's fix them. So, and the problem with all of these things is if you're a person with a disability and that's what you've heard throughout life, then why would you tell anyone that you have a disability? Because you're taught to think that the way you are is shameful, immoral, very sad, or something's wrong with you. Okay, I'm gonna take a minute and let her out. And
Now I can hear.
Yeah, she has a lot to say right now. I'll be right back.
Okay.
I remember in college, I was told that like my depression, anxiety, and like my borderline stuff was all either because I did not have enough faith. And if I had enough faith, I would just never have those feelings, or that I had a demon inside me. And so it was very like interesting the way that, for many people, like faith or leaning on spirituality or, that greater connection is so important, but often it can just be weaponized. And that shame that people try to like input is just, devastating, and it can have like lifelong repercussions on so many different ways. And so that's both with mental health, but even like the physical health journey as well. So.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, I think about like when I was diagnosed with DID, I was terrified and didn't want anybody else to know that I had it. And for years and years and years, the only people that knew I had it were my partner and then just maybe one or two people close to me. And all because I was ashamed of having a condition, that actually saved my life. So we silence people through that oppression, through ableism. Oh, I love this. I've been called a distraction before. Yeah. It's just incredible. I mean, and we do trainings and stuff on how to work with people with psychiatric disabilities in particular, because they've been told their whole lives that they're a big problem. So, okay. So something really important to know so as we wrap up that little section, is disability is actually very ordinary. It's this like normal thing that happens in our society and across the world. The diagnosis of that someone has, whether it's autism or a psychiatric disability or muscular dystrophy, does not predict the individual's experience. Not all people who have disabilities identify as having a disability, and the experiences of people with disabilities and deaf people are profoundly shaped by ableism and autism. In a similar way that the experience of Black, Indigenous, and other people of colors experiences are profoundly shaped by racism. So let's see, Morgan, people say, well, you seem normal. Oh my God, yes, you seem normal. I've had people, the term functional is another one of those terms. I have used that in the past as describing myself as having, I'm functional for someone with DID, which is so ableist. Like, we all function. We just function differently. So that's a really good point, Morgan. Okay, so I want to dig in a little bit on, let me see. So I'm gonna go through this section a little quicker because I think we have just talked about all this. So, so first, people with disabilities are marginalized, and we talked about how we've talked about them, how we've been socialized to think about them, but also our society is set up for people without disabilities, which then means anytime someone with the disability is trying to access any aspect of our society, we have to do things differently to allow them to access it. So then there has to be a request for that by a person with a disability. And then we have to do something special to enable them to access society. And that, of course, marginalizes them, right? So the other thing that happens is we have laws in place that allow us to exploit people with disabilities. My in-laws, Casey's, my partner, her aunt and uncle were people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And for years and years and years, they worked in a sheltered workshop where they would do assembly line work for pennies for a dollar, pennies per hour. And this was considered an honor for them to be able to do it. And it was completely legal to exploit their labor. And in the human trafficking world, people with disabilities are overrepresented in terms of survivors for the same thing, exploiting them for their disability checks, exploiting them because people feel sorry for them. So in terms of peddling or just exploiting them through in sex trafficking as well. It's a really large population. And then also there's this sense of powerlessness because that larger system is about kind of inculcating a sense of powerlessness. An oppressed group does not inherently believe that they're inferior, but they are taught over time that they are, because they're always being measured against the status quo. So when I was diagnosed when I was 31 years old, I knew right away that was a very stigmatized disorder, disability, and I did not want anybody to know that I had it. And how did I know it was stigmatized? The movie Sybil, the movie Three Faces of Eve, the ways in which people talked about people being crazy or having, multiple personalities. So that's all very, very much part of our society. All the ways in which we've stereotyped people, it's part of our society. So then what happens is if you are considered kind of, this outcast in our society because you don't fit what we consider the norm, which is people without disabilities, then you are at risk of being targeted by people. And that's where violence really kind of kicks in. And then violence is an effective tool for keeping people kind of in this oppressed position. And I know, so this is very similar to the ways in which racism works in our society. So this is just another way to oppress groups. And so what ends up happening is that we're not like different oppressed groups don't want to, like, we're left kind of not shining a light on people with disabilities in our communities. So, and then what happens is that people with disabilities are harmed, and the people who harm them do so with impunity. Okay. I think this is a good spot to take like is a 5-minute break okay for folks? And then I'll get into kind of like what we know about gender-based violence in the lives of people with disabilities. So I have 12:53, so we'll come back at 12:58. Okay. Okay, is everybody back? Because I know a lot of you haven't been having your camera on, so I can't tell whether you're there or not. So if you could just let me know in the chat. Oh, and Nicole. Hi, Becky. Okay, awesome. Morgan's back. Yes. Okay, cool. And Ingrid, so I'll go ahead and keep going. So there's ways in which gender-based violence in the lives of people with disabilities is very similar to what it is for people without disabilities. And then there's ways in which that it's different. So let's kind of go through that. If my thing will work, there we go. Okay, so one thing that's really different in the lives of people with disabilities. So for people without disabilities, it's an overwhelming amount of women that are survivors, victims of gender-based violence, and very, very few men. With survivors with disabilities, it's actually a larger number of men than without disabilities. That's still more women, but the statistics around men is significantly higher. So 14% of men with disabilities have reported experiencing sexual violence at some point in their lifetime, compared to 4% without disabilities. And again, the reporting rates are really low for people with disabilities. Women who've experienced intimate partner violence are nearly 4 times as likely to report a disability. 49% of people with developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities have been assaulted 10 or more times, and they are about 10 times more likely to be victimized. And then 20% of deaf adults have experienced physical abuse by an intimate partner violence. 15% have experienced forced sex by an intimate partner relationship. So it's a really significant difference. The numbers are really significant. And then the relationship, the power and control wheel is also a little different. In the ways in which power and control kind of show up in terms of the different types of abuse. So in turn, for targeting the disability with physical and sexual abuse, coercion and threat. So there's threats in terms of having them institutionalized, which is still a very real threat for people, or stealing their drugs, the medications, or withholding them, withholding treatment, withholding their devices, limiting their ability to communicate. All those things are are part of the dynamics of domestic violence for people with disabilities. The ways in which a person without a disability causes violence against a person with disabilities is, again, they make all the decisions themselves, even though the person could make their own decisions. I'm having a pet experience during our time together. Creates a lot of people can create physical barriers for people with mobility disabilities. And then stalking is much easier for people, and they'll take, what happens is they'll take over all the tasks, even tasks that people with disabilities can do. And then when then they'll use the ability to do those tasks against the person with the disability. So for example, someone, a partner could like go with that person to all their doctor visits, but then control those visits, when they go, whether they go, and what they tell the doctor. Because a lot of times the people that are meeting with people with disabilities talk to the other person that they come with, as opposed to them. Let me do one thing real quick. I'll be right back. I'm just gonna put my cat someplace. Don't normally have all this interruption during a training. Today's a special day. Okay, and then also, so anyway, so it looks a little bit different. I'm going to show you a little bit more how that shows up. The offenders are in some ways the same, and in other ways very different. So for people without disabilities, the intimate partner violence, the sexual violence might come from family members, partners, girlfriends, boyfriends, and acquaintances. That's the same. What you add in for people with disabilities is that 44% of offenders have a relationship with the individual because of the disability, right? So those might be personal care attendants, other caregivers, and then transportation drivers. So a lot of people with mobility issues have to use accessible transportation. And a lot of times people who are driving or connected to those are also offenders. It's a really big thing. Like, it's really interesting to me and doing this work to see how big a deal that is in terms of safety. There's also unique dynamics that come into play for people with disabilities. So because of the way our society thinks about people with disabilities, that we don't, as someone is growing up with a disability, we don't provide them with the same information. We don't arm them to take care of themselves. So there's a denial of information about healthy relationships. We, as a society, we think people with disabilities are not going to have sexual relations with people. So then we don't tell them about it. A lot of people with disabilities don't, when they have experienced sexual assault, for example, they don't always know that what they experienced was sexual assault. And then they can't tell people what they experienced because they don't know the names of their body parts. They don't know how to describe what happened to them. And then systemic oppression of people with disabilities, the isolation, the exploitation, the marginalization, all kind of feed into that. So then they don't have people outside of the person that might be causing them harm to be able to talk to. Or they're exploited in situations like the sheltered workshop. They might experience sexual violence there, but no one's going to believe them because they are thought to not really know what they've experienced. And then there's a lack of confidentiality. So because the deaf community in particular is very, very small, so it's hard to find people that are interpreters that aren't connected to the deaf community. So it's really hard for them then to be able to disclose information without it being shared. And that's similar to disability communities across the board. And then because a lot of people with disabilities have guardians, then they don't have control over the information. The information has to go to the guardian. And because there are so many policies around mandated reporting, once people find out that they've been victimized, they're supposed to report this to Adult Protective Services, and Adult Protective Services does an investigation. They lose control. They lose control over their lives. They lose control over what happens. And on top of all that, there is this sense that the people who the personal care attendants or the people who in their families take care of people with disabilities, that they're saints. Like that caring for someone with a disability is a burden. That's what we think in our society. So if they strike someone out of frustration, if they treat people badly because they're not getting enough rest, we don't hold them accountable. We admire them. We're like, wow, it's so great that you do this in our society. And that actually feeds into the level of impunity, so that people will do what they want to people with disabilities and will not be afraid of being reported, arrested, anything. So it's much, much harder here. Also, a lot of programs don't allow personal care attendants, don't allow service dogs. So there's a lack of access as well. And there's this fear of institutionalization. One of the clips I didn't show you was a clip from the movie Rain Man. And in the movie Rain Man, there's a scene where the Tom Cruise character is turning on the hot water to run a bath, and the Dustin Hoffman character has autism and is triggered because he had run a bath for Tom Cruise when he was a baby, and it was too hot, and he got burned, and Dustin Hoffman was sent away to an institution. And so one, that narrative was in this really big movie. Two, that's not uncommon still today. And it feeds into this fear that people with disabilities have, that they will lose their independence. It's huge. So fear institutionalization, there's also, and this has gotten worse since the pandemic, the loss of personal care and other services. So personal care attendants get paid, and they're often paid by the county or the state. And so their salaries are regulated by the county and the state. And after the pandemic, when salaries went up for unskilled workers, or for, lower kind of entry-level positions, so salaries at McDonald's and a lot of restaurants, fast food restaurants, went up to $15 to $20 an hour. Those are the same people that would be applying for to become a personal care attendant, and that salary stayed the same. I'll take Texas as an example. They get paid $7.25 an hour, and the work is more intense. And so a lot of people with disabilities have lost personal care attendants, and agencies that provide that kind of care are having a really hard time keeping staff because they can make more money somewhere else. And then again, another unique challenge to people with disabilities is that they don't know what they experienced was gender-based violence. A lot of people don't know that what they experienced was sexual assault or sexual abuse. I mean, I think about like the ways in which people without disabilities are told what's happening to them, if you add into that not knowing that people, like what your body parts are, you're not being told what's good touch and bad touch, any of that stuff, they're not going to know. So, and then again, they may have experienced violence throughout their lives by multiple offenders, and just not really even think that this is something that they should expect that doesn't happen to them. So, okay, so now I kind of want to touch upon a little bit about kind of the ways in which the system, access to the system is really hard for people with disabilities. So the unique dynamics on the systems level is, one, because of lack of confidentiality due to legal requirements like mandated reporting and guardianship laws, they may lose control over their information and over their lives. They also are led to believe that they deserve what's happened to them, that they are a burden, and that those closest to them, because they are the abusers, those are the people they need each day. And this is really kind of like when you think about people with disabilities and the way law enforcement responds to them. As soon as, if it's not a visible disability, but it's an invisible disability like autism, for example, as soon as the officer taking the report realizes they have autism, they all of a sudden don't believe the person. So as soon as a disability is disclosed, there's a lack of credibility that person, there is this belief that people with disabilities do not know what has happened to them. We had a project to develop training and technical assistance for law enforcement and prosecutors, and we did a needs assessment, and the needs assessment showed that officers are not trained about disabilities, and they have all these notions that people are not competent, people can't be believed. And in fact, we had somebody tell us in an interview with her that the officer told her that no one would believe that someone would sexually assault her when she was trying to file a report. And then there's the infantilization. So all the things that we talked about that came out of the movies, this is showing up in someone's ability to report. That's because they've been taught their whole lives that the police is who you go to when something happens to you. So there are lower rates of police follow-up, lower rates of prosecution, and very, very low rates of conviction when the abuse happens against a person with a disability. The judicial system is not physically or cognitively accessible. I mean, I'm a lawyer and I have a hard time understanding the legal jargon that's involved in cases. So I can't imagine not being a lawyer and also having a disability, like in particular cognitive disability, and not know what's going on. There's also no believability and credibility within the criminal justice system overall, that people with disabilities know what happened to them or not. And law enforcement lack knowledge of disability and accommodations in general. We did a pilot training for a group of 30 law enforcement and prosecutors in Salem, Massachusetts in December. There were 5 people in the room that knew stuff about disabilities, and everyone else did not anything. They were a really willing and eager group, so that was rewarding, but we have a lot of work to do. And it's interesting, they get scared. They're like, no, I'm not going to talk to them. I'm going to refer them to someone. And like, who? So the thing is, it's not, advocates are also struggling with serving people with disabilities. They usually pick up where the system responders leave off, or where, like, if you can at least get to an advocate, you can get some services and you're more likely to get accommodations, but not necessarily. So the added challenge is that gender-based violence programs that provide direct service to victims are inaccessible for survivors. And it's not just a physical inaccessibility. That's actually not as big a deal. I mean, it's hard when they can't, when they're in buildings that are older, that they're not able to modify, but it's attitudes. It's having things in plain language. It's using pictorial guides. It's people don't feel like they can believe them, or their rules don't allow service animals or personal care attendants. There's just kind of I think in large part because people are so stretched, and just things get kind of busier and busier. There's a hesitancy to expand what they do to be accessible. And it's not really that hard. So, and then the thing is there are disability organizations all around the country, but they're not set up to work with survivors. They're set up to help people get jobs, help people get independence, help people find accessible stuff. So like, there's independent living centers that help survivors live, get to and sustain living independently. There are, what do they call, Lighthouse for the Blind, which do a lot around Braille and helping people get materials that are in Braille, but none of them know about gender-based violence and are not going to be able to help survivors in that way. And then traditional victim services are not accessible, and they're not tailored to meet the unique needs of people with disabilities. And also then there's this response, there are these requirements that are connected to adult protective services that cause harm for people with disabilities. So these are really a lot of challenges that people face when trying to access safety. And that's why when we started and I showed you that only 12% of people with disabilities that have been harmed actually get to services. And when they get to the services, they're not necessarily helpful or accessible. Physical barriers still remain, which is not, that's everywhere. That's what people go to. I went to a program in DC. It was a legal services program in the Black community. And I was working with them. And when I got there, I knew that we were going to have an issue with the location because it was a long hill of stairs. But we just sat down and tried to figure out, like, does the public library, does another nonprofit in the area have a room that they can meet people at when they have mobility issues? So they don't need to create a ramp. They just need to be creative in how to do that. That's super easy. It's the communication stuff. That group is a legal group, and it was kind of beyond them, understandably, to try to figure out how they can do their documents in plain language because it's all legalese. And that was kind of easy to do. There's a group, the Victims' Rights Law Center, that's already started creating all their stuff in plain language. So there are really ways that are fairly easy to do this. It's just sitting down and figuring out, like, how do they do their work, what's accessible and what's not. But that's an attitude that people need to have in order to be able to sit down and do that. Like that program in DC wanted to become accessible, so they invited us in. The Monsoon, I worked with them as well to look at their program to see how they could be more accessible. They want to do it. A lot of programs don't want to do it, or just don't feel like they have the time. And they say, well, we don't have anybody. They don't have anybody because they're not accessible, or people aren't telling them. So they just don't lack the knowledge around disability in general, and the policies in place make it hard for people. So.
And then it always makes me wonder when people are like, well, we just don't have anyone. And, you know, all the people that are sitting there that have an invisible disability.
Exactly.
And that we don't identify.
Yeah.
And, you know, like when we were interviewing for the Garden of Truth research, like most of the women, a majority of the women that we interviewed had some sort of disability, and a lot of them had like traumatic brain injury.
Yeah.
So, you know, cognitive disabilities from their traumatic brain injury. And, you know, just thinking about how the world, you know, responds to them, and they don't get the services that they need, or people think they're just being combative or forgetful, or like, you know, all these things, they get all these other labels put on them,
Yeah.
and they get labeled as difficult and all the things, because
Yeah.
people don't also recognize the disabilities that they do have.
Exactly. And the thing is you could start, like, trauma informed is a nice place to start. Like, if you made all your services trauma informed, you're going to help a lot of people. And then people can ask for additional stuff because you'll be looking at things differently. You'll be looking at how to adapt versus, and you'll be, so the thing is to get people who think, it's a little bit of a cognitive behavior therapy thing, that when they think to themselves, wow, this person's uncooperative, they're not following through, when they think those things, that should be a little flag that says, oh, wait a second, I wonder if there's an invisible disability here that I don't know about. And because that's oftentimes what it is. So yeah, this is the tricky part. This is where we want, like, people who really want to do this. So I'm going to do a request for proposals in the next month or so to see if there are programs that want training in TA for how they can make their programs more accessible. We won't be able to provide funding for their time the way we could with this first group of people. But I'm hoping that there's going to be at least 3 organizations that would be interested in having us work with them. Transportation is a big, huge issue for people with mobility disabilities. It's really hard to find accessible options, and Uber really isn't accessible. People tend to kind of lean that way, but it just really isn't. So other barriers are, for deaf people in particular, ASL interpreters are a small, tight-knit community. Disability services might not have a strong connection to the deaf community, which is really common. Deaf services might only focus on communication access, but not anything else. And it's a little bit, deaf community is a little bit like spoken language communities, like they're a cultural group. So hiring or contracting with the deaf community or a deaf program, which is very far and few between, but that would be the best way, because then you would have basically a bicultural, bilingual situation. And then what happens too is that a lot of crisis lines aren't familiar with the communication devices that they have, or they might have old TTY, which isn't really effective. Video relay services are really more effective. And access to deaf advocates is few and far between. There's a sense of isolation within a shelter. I'm watching, I don't know if anybody watches the British baking show. Oh my God, I love that show. So I'm watching an old season, but it's their latest season, season 11, or at least the latest that's on Netflix. There's a deaf contestant, and because of where I work, I'm constantly talking to Casey about how inaccessible it is. Like, all the people talk to each other about what they're doing, but she can't, because she has to be doing it. She can't be having an interpreter, like telling her what everybody's saying because they're talking while they're baking. And there's like so many different ways in which you can see the difference between her experience and everyone else's experience. Anyway, so it's just interesting. I should do that in one of my workshops, is show like an episode from that season. She's doing really well. I haven't seen the
She
whole
is
thing
doing
yet.
good. I just finished that season.
Oh, did you? Oh, okay. I'm at the quarterfinals.
I won't spoil it for you.
Don't spoil it for me. So, but a good thing that people can do is learn more about deaf culture. We have a bunch of videos and we provide training on that. We also have a deaf service line. So that if one of the programs that you guys provide TA for, if they come across a deaf survivor and they don't know people in the community, they can reach out to our deaf service line. We have deaf advocates and advocates that are and access to ASL interpreters. And then we'll refer people. There's only 22 programs around the country that work with deaf survivors.
Oh,
Yeah.
that is so low.
That is so low.
Wow.
That's why we developed this deaf service line, because we could address communication. We would have somebody who could talk with them to communicate with them, and then they could refer them to one of the programs around the country.
It's crazy. We have a really good group of Indigenous ASL interpreters that we work with that are just really phenomenal. And we just bring to all of our
That's
events
awesome.
that we have available, because to your point, like, so, that people don't show up because you don't have it. And so
Right.
our practice has been just to have it, to
Yeah.
have an ASL interpreter there.
That's
So
awesome. Yeah, that's really awesome. And it'll be, then everybody will see that that's just the way you do it. So I'm going to stop there and just kind of check in. The next section is on accommodations. Let me just see. How are you all doing? Hi, everybody. Good. Okay, we still have a half hour, so we can start the accommodations piece, or we could stop here and do accommodations next time. So I'm going to let you all vote. Morgan, thumbs up. Okay, so thumbs up for stopping or thumbs up for going into accommodations? Okay, so raise your hand if you want to keep going and we start doing accommodations. Okay, oh, so whatever works. Okay. And then how about if we, or how many of you want to do accommodations next week?
what would work best for you, Olga?
Let's see, how much do I have? I worry that I've been talking at you all for a little while. So I kind of think maybe this would be a good place to stop. And then we'll do accommodations and accessibility next week.
Okay.
Okay.
Did people have any questions or anything before we wrap up on what was covered today? As I was listening, I was thinking, this would be so good to have, with the TSASP grantees, is there like, because they are all providing services in Indian country, and I know that the accessibility piece is huge, because there's just fewer resources. So it would be good to have that. It'd also be good to have this session at our statewide conference.
Yeah, I think it might do a little bit better in person. But Deb, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say that Olga did present on this topic for TSAS at our Connect and Reflect, and it went over really well.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that's why I was thinking, like, if we did it, if there was not that, so I don't want to travel very much, so that's the other part of it. But I tend to prioritize your stuff, because I don't know. Anyway, but so doing it in person is really nice because you get a feel, and then the discussion is more likely to happen. And I think in the discussion about how you do something,
Yeah.
would be really helpful. I have a couple of videos that I'll use next week about people talking about people with disabilities, brown and black people with disabilities in particular, talking about needing accommodations, and then examples of how to ask.
Okay. We just put out our RFP for our statewide conference, which is going to be in Hinckley at the Grand Casino Hinckley in April. So,
okay.
If you're
And that's
interested.
the statewide, that's the advocates.
Yep, that's Minnesota.
Okay.
Well, and as you were just speaking to, it made me think about, we literally just were having a national TA team meeting before this, where we spent a big chunk of time just like talking about our processes and how like our ASL interpreters and just
awesome.
all of the different pieces, like we talked about what we learned at TSASP, Nicole, because you weren't on that call, and like the balance of creating a space, right, that is just accessible and folks don't have to ask, with the balance of respecting like the interpreters' time and exposure and emotional toll that like interpreting that this takes on, and like so it's not performative if no one there is needing the ASL, like, right, like just all of these different things. And so I think this like training with you is super timely, just in the conversations that we're having internally, and then being able to pass on, and just like we want to be able to do this in a good way that is like setting the tone and setting the space, and also like being respectful, and then figuring out like, because I know Hercules in particular was like really wants to help us in like, we're doing all this accommodating, but finding ourselves in lots of spaces where there aren't folks, we haven't reached the folks maybe who need to be there, who need that like accommodation, right, exactly. And so just that too, like what are other spaces that MIWSAC can be looking in to be like talking about our work, and who are other folks that we can be connecting to, so that we are making sure that we're just accessible in a variety of ways. So this is timely, and I'm like very interested to continue the conversation, because I think it's like we're learning and trying to lift up, like Native interpreters, like Nicole said, and lots of really good learning, and lots of like just thinking about like the processes. So
it's really, I think because you're at the kind of a little bit of the beginning, having those interpreters are really valuable, because people will start noticing, and that's when you'll start finding people coming that need it. And then asking, like we do them on all our webinars. We have ASL interpreters. I did not have ASL interpreters for the pilot training for police and prosecutors, because I checked to make sure that we didn't have anybody. And it is pretty rare to find, deaf police and prosecutors. But not when we do stuff with advocates, we have them all the time. So it's a balance, but people won't come until they realize that you are serious about doing this.
That was exactly what we were talking about. And then even just some of the things that just in our learning, like we need to make sure it's on all of our flyers, that, like it's not, it doesn't seem like an afterthought, even if we're being intentional, like if it's not explicitly stated, like then we've kind of had a missed opportunity there too. So it's just like a lot of.
Okay, I'm gonna do our accessibility stuff next week, because it tells you all about that, like 14-point font, which types of fonts to use, how to make your website accessible. I'll kind of just go through it all, not expecting that you'll be able to take it all from the training, but then you'll know, you'll be able to take some of the stuff away, and then you can come back whenever you're ready to do the next few steps. But pictorial guides, I'll just tell you right up front, are really, really helpful. And I also found some really good resources on the autism self-advocate network. I can never remember which A goes where. But so they have a whole bunch of stuff in plain language. That's really nice. I just downloaded a bunch of videos on racism that they did that's all in plain language, because it's I'm doing a training for a group of a program that is by and for people with intellectual disabilities. So I was trying to figure out how to talk about racism in plain language, because I'm not sure I can. So these videos are really nice. So it's a good website to go to see what kinds of stuff they have in plain language. And also, once we're done with these trainings, you can just reach out to me and we have stuff online about how to do stuff in plain language or how to make your programs more accessible. So I'm happy to help anytime. All right, cool. So Jolene, we're going to stop here.